My name is Martin Mee, and I am filling in for Pamela Sadler, who unfortunately contacted COVID yesterday. So last minute swap there. To my right, I have Emily LaFontaine with Turner Construction. And down here, I have Francesca Oliveira with Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill. Today, we are going to talk about an inside look at carbon accounting with the BCCA and Cal Green codes. So this course will analyze these new code measures while guiding design and building professionals on finding a pathway to compliance. Learning objectives very quickly, understanding how to design a BCCA Cal Green compliant project, recognizing how to overcome common challenges in building compliant projects, understanding the documentation steps, and evaluating the responsibilities. Carbon emissions of buildings. So basically, they categorize carbon into two different categories. One is embodied carbon. This correlates to the product and the construction. So things like raw materials, transport, manufacturing, A1 to A3, cradle to gate, including construction, transport, construction installation, and that goes to A1 to A5, cradle to use. For operational carbon, that's the building usage and end of life. So A1 to C4, cradle to grave. Things like operations, maintenance, repair, deconstruction, transportation, and disposal. Environmental Product Declarations, EPDs. EPDs are the industry standard document used to assess the environmental impacts of a building material throughout its lifetime. Type 3 EPDs can either be industry-wide, product-specific, facility-specific, or supplier-specific. So one study reported that buildings account for 40% of global carbon emissions. 11% of that comes from building materials, and 28% of that approximately comes from building operations. And as we all know here in this room, and a lot of us in attendance, California is definitely leading the way in the US to decarbonize these buildings. In 2022, the Buy Clean policy was introduced and updated codes to include embodied carbon provisions and limits. The Buy Clean California Act. DGS and the California Air and Resources Board have established global warming potential limits for eligible products. Effective July 1st, 2022, public work projects will need to meet these requirements, and compliance is demonstrated by using type 3 EPDs. These eligible products include various steels, concrete, glass, and mineral wool insulation. And now I'm going to turn it over to Emmy.
Thank you. Well, nice to see you all, everybody. My name is Emmy LaFontaine. I work for Turner Construction, and my title is Sustainability Strategy Manager. That means a few things. That means I'm trying to figure out how we meet our ESG goals, 2030, 2040. How does that relate to embodied carbon? What kind of intermediate steps can we put into place between now and then? But another part of my role is to figure out how we as contractors can make sure that within certain states, primarily California is where a lot of regulations are coming out. How do we make sure that our project teams are complying with all these regulations that come out, right? It's really hard to keep on top of it. We have a lot of projects going on in California, a lot of project engineers, a lot of them are fresh out of college. Some of them have been out of college for a long time, but it's pretty new for a lot of folks. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is from the contractor's perspective. How do we interact with a lot of these regulations that are coming out? And today, specifically, I'm going to focus on the Buy Clean California Act. And so there's a few learning objectives I wanted to cover. One is, what should I be looking for in an EPD as a general contractor? What are some of the common pitfalls that are encountered for a lot of these materials? And then how can I set up a project to make sure that we avoid those pitfalls, right? So I wanted to start by kind of talking about how to read an environmental product declaration. Now, if you're not familiar with an environmental product declaration, it's basically a nutrition label for the embodied carbon of a product. And there's a lot of things that we need to look for when we're looking at these EPDs to determine compliance with Buy Clean California. The first thing that we need to look for is it valid? Now, the life cycle of a typical EPD is about 5 years. Now, you can definitely get EPDs more frequently for that, but most EPDs you'll see a lifespan of about 5 years, which means that if you're starting a project, at a time when the EPD is valid and you haven't bought it out and maybe that EPD becomes invalid over the life of the procurement cycle, you need to really make sure that you're not procuring materials that have an invalid EPD. Because sometimes for these larger state projects, it can have a lead time of upwards of 2 years before you start buying materials, right? So another one that we want to look for is it facility specific? So in Buy Clean California, it's really important to make sure that the facility that you procure the material from is listed on the environmental product declaration, and that the GWP that you're looking at for that specific facility is clearly spelled out. And I have a couple of examples that I'll show you later on what to look for there. You also have to make sure that it's independently verified. Now, I'm not going to get into the different types of type 1, type 2, type 3 EPDs, but just know that for Buy Clean California, the DGS and the authority having jurisdiction is going to be looking for a type 3 EPD that is compliant with all of those ISO standards that are listed on there. We're also going to want to make sure that it's third-party reviewed in compliance with what's called a product category rule. Now, the concept of a product category rule is basically when you look at drawing the boundaries for a carbon footprint or a eutrophication potential or whatever it is for a type of product, the way that you draw those boundaries for mineral wool insulation is going to be different than how you draw those boundaries for structural steel. And so there are different governing organizations that determine the product category rules. The specific PCR that is applicable to the Buy Clean California legislation is listed on the Buy Clean website. So just make sure that you're looking at that and looking at something that's compliant. This is going to be particularly relevant when you look at materials that are procured abroad, right? Because if you have a different governing organization in China, for example, where you might have been planning on buying your steel from, that's going to pose challenges when you're trying to procure steel that's compliant for California. Generally, a lot of the PCRs that have been set by the state of California were made in conjunction with a lot of industry organizations that are focused in the United States, like the American Institute for Steel Construction. So just be really careful if you are planning on buying material internationally that those PCRs are exactly the same. And then the last, but certainly not least thing that you need to check for is, does the global warming potential limit that's been stated on the EPD fall below the limit that's been set by Buy Clean California? And we're going to look a little bit into what that looks like. So some of the common pitfalls in Buy Clean California. I've actually broken out I've broken out a case study for each of the 4 materials that are covered in Buy Clean California. Now, again, the 4 material categories that are covered in Buy Clean California are structural steel, rebar, flat glass, and mineral wool insulation. Notably missing are things like concrete, right? Those are currently excluded from Buy Clean California, but are going to be covered in the Cal Green compliance section that Francesca's going to be covering. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about that we encountered with steel rebar as being a challenge was that not all of the facility-specific global warming potentials listed in the EPD, the Environmental Product Declaration, were under the threshold limits. This is kind of the most basic one that most people hyper-focus on, right? So you really have to look at which facility are you planning on buying your, doesn't look on the TV. Which facility are you planning on buying your material from? So for example, in this case, we were looking at buying it from Connecticut. It ended up being above the threshold. So we had to engage with our rebar supplier to make sure that they were providing a material that was from a facility that was below that threshold. For structural steel, there's a bunch of different types of structural. There's hot roll, there's plate, there's hollow. We have been encountering more issues with hollow than some of the other structural steel material categories, which is why I wanted to highlight it. The problem that we encountered on the project that we were working on most recently was that the boundaries for the global warming potential and how that was counted were not broken out correctly between unfabricated and fabricated values. So flipping ahead to what exactly I'm talking about, the original EPD that was provided, all EPDs generally spell out how you account for carbon within the EPD production process. Now, the challenge that we encountered for this specific product was that they had assumed that the raw material supply, in other words, the A1 function, included steel coil production, transport to manufacturing, and HSS. So what in reality, if you look at the actual way that Buy Clean California delineates A1 to A3, which are those different life cycle standards, it's called cradle to gate, right? Where basically A1 is considered the actual manufacturing. It's the pouring of the material into the billets, for example, and then you transport that's A2 to the fabricator. Versus what they had been assuming for A1 to A3 was just the production of the billets effectively. So it's really important that you understand how those lines are getting drawn, because Buy Clean California delineates between the unfabricated material, which is this first A1 section on the right-hand side, versus the A1 to A3, which is the whole right-hand side of the equation. And there are limits associated with both of those categories that you need to stay below. So the solution for that is just make sure that you're verifying unfabricated versus fabricated GWP potentials, and that you're working on that with the manufacturer to determine Buy Clean California compliance. Another topic is mineral wool board insulation. This is actually one of the trickier products within the Buy Clean California compliance legislation to navigate as a project engineer on a job site. So make sure to spend special attention on this. And the reason that it's a little bit complicated. Oh, okay, thank you. One of the reasons why it's complicated is because you have to do math on this one, which most people aren't really ready to do on a job site. And I'll show you exactly what I mean. So this is rock wool's cavity rock. That's what we used in this example, where there's a table where the basis of the global warming potential calculation is the safe and sound product, which has a functional scale factor of 1, which basically says the baseline assumption you should have for GWP for insulating products is 1.31 kilograms of CO2 per meter squared. And you multiply it by 1. Now, if you multiply it by 1.6 to get the cavity rock, if that's what's been specified, the total GWP value that you should be assuming for that product is 2.1, okay? So I don't know if that's making sense so far, but effectively you have to use this table to identify the product that you're using against the GWP you should assume for it. And to further complicate it, you also have to look at the facility specific information, right? So now that we know what the cavity rock product is, which facility are you getting it from? And then that's the value that you want to cross-check against the global warming potential limit. Now, it's actually not too hard once you digest it, but if you handed this to any project engineer on a job site, it could get a little bit complicated to look at these tables. And so one of the recommendations that we provide is that ask Rockwool to get involved in a situation like this, or like ask your supplier to help you navigate these tables. I guarantee most of the major mineral insulation providers have thought about this already and can probably navigate the project team towards the correct answer. So making sure that you have that second opinion and making sure it's correct is really important. And I think in this specific project, which is called RBR, we actually got a letter from Rockwool which said this product is compliant. Let me spell it out for you on why it is, which was really helpful for proving that to the AHJ that we are compliant with regulation. Flat glass is also a tricky one, but in a different way. Flat glass is a little challenging in that it's untreated glass, which kind of throws off a lot of projects because most glass that we encounter in commercial and construction has been heat treated or tempered or laminated or whatever, right? So we need to look at, for Buy Clean California, the flat glass, which is untreated. Aside from that, I would say compared to a lot of other industries, I think there's a lot fewer EPDs product-specific EPDs made available for glass. And it's not that they don't exist, but it's a little bit more challenging to get. And in this specific project, we were given an industry-wide EPD, which is in excess of the Buy Clean California limits, which was the challenge. And then when we got the actual facility-specific EPD, we found out that they were above the threshold for a facility that we were originally planning on going to. So what we would recommend is confirming that the proposed product is flat glass, first of all. Are we looking at the right number when we're looking at this? And then again, similar to the structural steel comment, making sure that they are delineating their boundaries for accounting correctly, because this is newer to the flat glass industry. And then verifying again that those global warming potential limits are indeed below those thresholds. So ideally, you can have a simple column which says, what is the number that has been provided for that specific facility, and how does it compare to the limit? I'm not going to spell this out too much because I just mentioned it, but again, flat glass is what goes into the processing methods. That makes sense. Okay, and how do we manage it? So we spelled it out based on the phase. So when you're in design, definitely make sure that the specified products meet Buy Clean California limits. So for example, mineral insulation being a great example, don't specify an insulating product that you know just by selecting it as an architect that it's already above the threshold. That's a little bit different for performance-based things like structural steel or rebar, where the architect really doesn't care what it looks like or what material you choose as long as it meets performance requirements. And the onus is truly on the general contractor to make sure that they're staying below the threshold. But for any specified products like mineral insulation, make sure that it's below the threshold as an architect. And then at this point, you also want to get ahead of the game by identifying the awarding authority responsible for the approval and verification. So for example, who do we hand the Buy Clean conformance documentation to? Like, what's the name of the person? And then reach out to that person and understand their process for how they want to receive the information. So a state school might have a state school organization that has a Dropbox and they have presentations on exactly where you send it to. This is a real scenario, obviously. DGS might have a different person and a different way of receiving that. It's possible they don't have a system in place for how to reviewing it, but we have to understand as a project team and still do our due diligence with documentation and make sure that we're planning on submitting the way that they want to see it. As a contractor, one of my favorite lessons learned is that the person that estimates the project and signs the bid form is often not the same person managing it, right? And so oftentimes there's a disconnect between the person who signs the company up for complying with Buy Clean and the person who actually has to procure the material. And so one of the ways that you can make sure that that handoff is clear between those two firms is by having a sub onboarding meeting and also a closed down meeting at the time of bid, right? Congratulations on being awarded the project. Just want to make sure that you have the insurances in place, that you have builder's risk in place or whatever, that you are fully aware that this is a Buy Clean California project and that you're planning on procuring material that's compliant, right? And then make sure that you're requesting and reviewing those materials as soon as humanly possible. So for example, if you have to procure compliant structural steel and at time of bid, the subcontractor says we're good for complying with that Buy Clean limit, but then they come back and say we're going to get it from China, I would want to make sure that they are providing EPDs as soon as humanly possible to make sure that, can you really get it from China and have it be compliant with Buy Clean California? Prove it to me. Show me the document. Because otherwise, if you're planning on a lead time that's 8 weeks long for this material, and in reality, it's 20 weeks long because you're procuring it from an entirely different country, we need to adapt to that as general contractors. Ideally, you're doing that a little bit before bid time as well. And for submittals, make sure that you're receiving authority having jurisdiction confirmation in writing before doing the submittal process. This helps make sure that you're not going through any trips later on in the process and you don't get held up on your submittal process. Track all of the EPDs, make sure you have a really good document management system. And then again, you have manufacturers that presumably have a sustainability expert on board who can help you navigate these different documents. So don't hesitate to reach out to those people as well. Some lessons learned, and I'll try and keep this quick, but keep in mind that the units on an EPD may be different from those that are used within the Buy Clean California regulation. You know, maybe it's pounds versus kilograms or tons versus kilograms. It's really important to just double check that. Include Buy Clean California reviews within the sustainability contracts consultant. This is particularly relevant if you're a general contractor. A lot of times there's overlap between having Buy Clean regulations and LEED, right? And maybe the architect's got a LEED consultant on board that is totally equipped to handle reviewing LEED documentation, but then they're not on board to review Buy Clean compliance, which as a general contractor, ideally we're not the only people reviewing something for regulatory compliance. Ideally, there's another set of eyes that's authorized that has it in their contract to review it. So make sure that's written into the scope of work. And if you're an architect or an owner or designer, also really being clear on who's doing that within their roles and responsibilities is really important. Collect written confirmation. This is going to cover you as general contractors and a design team to make sure that everything that you're putting into the job is compliant and you're not going to get any unpleasant surprises later. And know that if you are doing your due diligence early on and you know that one of your intended suppliers does not have an EPD, anticipate it taking about 3 to 6 months at least for them to be actually getting that EPD. So we're not saying that you can't use somebody who doesn't have an EPD, but you have to really do some aggressive pre-construction efforts to make sure that by the time of procurement that they do have an EPD in hand. The other thing that you want to make sure is that reviewing the subcontractor purchase orders match the submitted EPD. We haven't seen this very often, but it has happened where the submitted product was actually swapped out for a different facility, for example, afterwards, just because of logistics. So making sure that the facility that's been noted on the EPD that you're procuring it from matches the mill order is really important. And then make sure to track all of the EPDs with some kind of a matrix that you can easily show to an AHJ later on to make sure that you've got that. So this is really overwhelming. It's overwhelming for me to look at as well. But you know, big picture, did our due diligence, figured out who wasn't allowed to provide material and who was based on the list of materials that was included on the job. So this is our quick point of reference and just told us, you know, this guy's good to go, this guy's not. And here's who we ended up selecting. If you want to do a deeper dive into this matrix, I'm happy to connect with you later. But it's a lot of words to look at on the screen. And then just some parting thoughts and tips. Make sure that you have staff time that's allocated to this. I would say that if you've got a recent college grad that doesn't know what RFI stands for, they're probably not the right person to be managing BCCA compliance. So make sure that you've got time for it. Make sure that person is familiar with enough of the contracting process to verify compliance and realize that it is a risk if you don't have somebody dedicated to it. Again, sustainability consultant, really important to identify who that person is that's reviewing compliance on the design side. Make sure that it's written into the sustainability requirements early on. We've had a couple of state-funded projects that didn't have Buy Clean limits written into the Division 1 specifications. That's a huge risk. And it makes it really complicated as a general contractor to have to deal with that with your subcontractors. And then finally, specifications reviews. So making sure in this specific project, we actually encountered that there was a project global warming potential limit, and then there is the Buy Clean limit that was listed, and they were not the same number. And that also creates challenges. So making sure that when you do your due diligence as a general contractor or designer, that you're actually looking for discrepancies like that and making sure we all are on the same page in terms of what the expectations are, that's going to be really important. And then here's the image of the project that we did this on most recently. It's a project up in Sacramento, and it now looks completely different with an all new skin. So we're really excited about having this be our first start to finish Buy Clean California job. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Francesca. You want to talk about project? Yes.
All right. So just as a curiosity, who's completely overwhelmed and thinking, holy heck, how am I going to document this as an architect? Yeah, right. Well, guess what? We're gonna have to document this as architects, so let's just walk through this together and how we do this. So as of July 1st of this year, the California code has been amended with a typical errata that we have mid-cycle. And as part of that, Cal Green has now adopted reporting for embodied carbon that is mandatory for all projects that are non-residential over 100,000 square feet and schools that are over 50,000 square feet. There is a prescriptive path and there are two performance paths, and we'll unpack that in just a minute. The great news is you cannot reduce what you cannot measure, right? This is a good thing. So I know that it feels at first blush that this is a bit terrifying and scary. I assure you it's not. We're going to walk you through a project on how we did it even before the regulations were in place and that it is possible to do. But it's a good thing for us to be moving in this direction because we as an industry need to continue driving down carbon. And so let's just unpack these parts. For this, we have been understood from the state that they will continue to reduce these regulations in terms of they'll lower the area threshold of buildings that are going to comply. So if you may be unscathed by these limits and where you currently practice, this number is going to continue going down. So be forewarned. The types of materials will also continue to expand. The percentage of reductions are going to continue to drop. So know that this is kind of the entree into this. So kind of a la early lead where it was a little easier on the first entry point. This is going to continue to ratchet down, and that's a good thing. And we'll keep track of each of these scopes, again, focusing specifically on leveraging those type 3 EPDs. So I'd mentioned there are 3 paths. There's a prescriptive path. If you guys actually can read the code language directly in Cal Green's codes right now, and there are worksheets that are set up for you to fill out and that you'll have to, as an architect, actually sign and say that you will have looked at these, that you're in compliance, both during design and that you will work with the contractor to do this during construction as well. So make sure that's part of your contract language that you are going to have to carry that responsibility as a licensed architect in your projects moving forward. So right now, the limits on the prescriptive path are actually very generous. And that, again, that number is going to ratchet down. For the same materials that are covered in Buy Clean California, we're going to be looking at 175% of global warming potential limits that are set by the industry averages. So it's above average today. Again, this is going to keep ratcheting down. So I think this is part of getting your process set in your next round of projects that you understand how you document this. And again, I'll show you an example. Beyond that, there's voluntary options where you actually can go 10 and 20% further beyond the limits as opposed to just simply being prescriptive. So do take a look at this as you're starting projects that are in compliance with this. So let me walk you through a case study. So is this possible? Yes, because we actually did this as of starting design in 2020, before regulations even occurred. So I want to introduce you to the San Mateo County Office Building 3. We are just finishing this. And so what's exciting is finishing this month, we started design in the middle of the pandemic in 2020. And as a group, we were given that this building will be net zero energy for operations. And we said to the client, would you be open to low embodied carbon? And they said, sure, if you can keep it on budget. Well, challenge accepted. We love that challenge. So what we did as a team, this and the Cal Green compliance requirements, this isn't going to happen by chance. If you think that you're going to do business as usual and this will magically occur and you'll be in code compliance, you're going to be running into a brick wall. I want you guys to really start thinking differently as you start projects. You can't just pull your old spec and bring it forward. You really have to be thoughtful about what you're picking in each of these categories. So holistically, as a team, during concept design, we set as a design team, where are the carbon limits and where are we going to target for both embodied and operational, right? So again, this doesn't happen by chance. There was a plan. I wanted to share with you some of this work here about where is the carbon, right? It's not everywhere. It's not going to be in your door handles. Though we had 1,000 doors on the project, it wasn't there. That wasn't going to move the needle. We focused where the biggest buckets were. So making sure you lean in where the opportunity is. Right now, your superstructure and your substructure is carrying a significant percentage, 50 to 60% of your carbon. And so really working closely with your engineers on that particular scope. For the architects in the room and online, we have 20 to 30% in enclosure. And I think that's us as an industry. We need to keep doing better on that. We have aluminum that's high in embodied carbon. Also glass. It was great to see that glass is in Cal Green. Let's keep partnering with our manufacturers to ask the right questions and continue to drive low carbon products to the market. For the interior side, you're also carrying 20 to 30%. Watch your service life. How often are things going to be replaced within your building, and thinking through the value of the carbon that you're putting in from there. So just want to make sure you're aware of the hotspots and that you're not going to necessarily go and reduce everything, reduce it where you're going to have the most impact. So some examples here. So this is actually the building as designed in 2020. It is an H in shape for its efficiency for both air movement and light infiltration here. There's a campus entrance both on the north side and then a city entrance from the south side. This is it from just a couple of weeks ago. We are nearly fully occupied and 5 more rooms to punch list. So keep your fingers crossed for me because we're almost there. But what's exciting about this is it actually is a mass timber building. And so we are 5 stories of mass timber. It's type 4 HT. This was lobby and design of concept, and here is it in its built state. Nearly finished now, all on the inside. We're just, like I said, 5 more rooms to go. The office space as envisioned. And if I can get it to move forward, right before all the users have moved in, and it is now covered with books and other fun tchotchkes. So it's fun to see it with full life. Yes, sorry. Questions are. I'll give you that part of the story. It's a great question. So I did mention it's in H shape. There's a question in the room about, or did we always start with mass timber? No, is the answer. But let me tell you why. So we started here as an H shape. North is to the right in the plan. So very thin, hardworking bar, 65 feet in width, about 250, 280 feet in length. Very efficient in its process. So great from all the passive design. So I'd mentioned the process is what I want you guys to walk away from today. This doesn't happen by doing the same thing we always do. You got to think differently. So I mentioned we set all of these principles in concept. At the time when we were doing the design in 2020, we actually didn't really understand what EPD was and what is embodied carbon and what's an A1 to A3. We had to do a lot of educating of our teams and then making sure that we were thoughtful about each of the steps that we were doing in design. So to answer the question from the room is we actually at SOM, we explore all materials on every project. We love iteration. We love research because we're fun like that. And so we actually challenged ourselves to look at the entire structure in 3 different materials. And we actually not only built and designed the engineering of the structure in all 3 materials, we also had them cost estimated to confirm that what was really the delta. Maybe perhaps to challenge and disprove, does low embodied carbon have to be more costly? It doesn't, is the answer. When we looked at each of these, each material has a benefit. Can you use the material where it is going to be most beneficial? In the end, the project actually uses all 3 materials. We use the concrete in the substructure. We use the steel at the 4 seismic cores that we need for lateral bracing, as well as all of my 2-hour rated components, right? And then we have timber in all of the other places. So we actually ended up using a hybrid of all 3, but the driving force in this one is timber. It is type 4 HT under the old version of the code, right? Because we hadn't actually even adopted the new codes yet for mass timber. So I think good news for California, Marin actually has been leading the way, and they themselves have issued code regulations about concrete and reductions in carbon there. So I do encourage all of you, don't start from scratch. Like we did leverage the codes that are already available to you. And these limits were based actually on what is available here in the Bay Area. And so this isn't a pipe dream. This is not a unicorn. This is something that is actually you can procure in a readily available fashion. So try to leverage this. Think about how can I replace Portland cement with other materials? I feel like that's something we're pretty familiar with and used to. How can we also challenge ourselves to minimize cement in our mixtures and thinking about, are there limitations that we have on cure times? Do we have an opportunity that we can go beyond the 28 days, perhaps go to the 54, 56 range? That helps us to reduce our carbon limits in what's used. So really thinking creatively about that and challenging yourself from the day-to-day practice there. I think as mentioned from Emmy, the AISC has actually taken a lot of great strides in trying to document and require EPDs since 2014, which was really fantastic. So this information is available and out there. And I recommend that you do that due diligence research while you're in design so that you can document it as part of the specifications. In terms of the timber itself, I wanted to give you a structural plan that we had done. You can see this was in October 2020. And the majority of the structure is mass timber for COB3. And we had just these small, tiny steel cores. Again, that was all my lateral and seismic bracing there. So that's where I was limited on my steel, my CLT. So this was cross-laminated timber. It was a 5-ply system. I had an Acoustomat and 3 inches of gypcrete, so I tried to keep it light. In the end, the cost question came about. We have terrible soil at this location. We are in bay mud, and it is as not useful as it could possibly be. And so not only do we have 300 piles below this particular building, we had to keep it light. And so mass timber, from a savings point of view, and I say savings intentionally, helped us because of the substructure. So as you're looking at these exploration of materials and trying to judge embodied carbon, don't look at just that one material. If you narrow yourself to that one scope, you're never going to get an apples to apples comparison. Where are the other benefits that you have? In this instance, we were able to significantly reduce the quantity of piers that we had. In addition, we were able to reduce the time of construction, right? Just by simply going for a lighter, faster material to install. I did mention we had a contractor on board at the time, and they were able to do cost studies. The three different structural systems actually came in between 5 and 8% of cost to each other, just apples to apples. And then there were other offsetting factors that came into play, like the time of construction, or could I eliminate other materials? This is actually our structural engineers here at SOM are fascinated by carbon and have been since the early 2000s, and have actually issued a set of tools that you can download and look at some of these components where you can actually say, could you just look at the structural system itself and how much is it reduced? So just the structure by itself, going from a concrete or steel baseline, which are nearly identical in carbon in this instance, to a mass timber predominant building, we were able to reduce just the structure by 85%. And this number was from a schematic design evaluation and held through to the end of construction. So as we moved into DD, the architects rolled up their sleeves and did the same level of calculations and looked at our material selections. We didn't limit ourselves just to those categories from Buy Clean. We actually looked at really everything in those hot spots we first covered with each other. The mass timber itself, just a note here, people often ask how long does it take to regrow the wood? 18 minutes in the United States and Canada is the answer. And so that's an incredibly fast period of time. So I do want to encourage you to look at rapidly renewable materials. You'd be surprised how fast they renew when things are manufactured and procured sustainably. So the architecture team specifically targeted both glass and insulation with two main principles to think about. First, build less. It's the simplest answer on how we design. We've designed our way into this problem of climate, challenge. We can design our way out of it. How do you do more with less? And then if you have to use something, can you build wise on what you're doing? And so as we did these targets, specifically looking at the products, there happened to be within SOM, starting in 2019, we took on this challenge and we named it D-Specs. So we challenged ourselves to say, could we decarbonize and dechemicalize our specifications? So as a firm, we agreed we would do a firm-wide research effort that took us 3 years and 40 teams around the world to do. And we basically targeted the 80% of the most of the specifications that we use that impacted the most carbon. And so teams in each of their projects did analysis to look at both what material was available in EPDs, what were the global warming potentials, what were the service lives for all those materials, and then we ran an analysis to say what really are the right products that we should be using. First, are they fit for purpose? And then second, if they are fit for purpose, what is the best of class in that group? Everyone that was on our list for preferred manufacturers for a spec that has been tried and true for years, if you didn't have the required documentation that we could do this analysis, we wrote you a love note and said, we would like this information. Transparency is important. Will you give us this information? Some people said, yes, we have it. Here it is. Some people said, what's an EPD? We said, great, you should figure that out because you got 6 months or you're out of our spec worldwide. And we do 150 projects a year. And they said, are you serious? We said, yes. And that's how the conversation went for 3 years. And we were able to get a lot of traction from a lot of manufacturers saying, this matters to you? You want us to do this? Yes, we do. And that was important as an architect to realize you have the power of the pen, right? This buy clean isn't happening to you. These embodied carbon calculations aren't just another hurdle we have to get through. No, actually, this is an opportunity for us to have dialogue and conversations with manufacturers to see how we can move the needle forward. Manufacturers don't want to make 5 different versions of a product. They want to be cost effective in their manufacturing. If we all want the most lower embodied carbon product, that's what they want to be able to give us, but that means we have to ask for it, right? Making sure that you're asking those questions. So where did we target? So the timber did help us a lot. I was able to reduce with the team 70% of our ceilings. For a office building of 5 stories, we only have 30% ceiling coverage in the entire building. That is an incredibly low number for an office building where we're used to seeing ACT ceilings covering all MEP. That did mean that the MEP was exposed, and that took a lot of coordination. So please don't underestimate that if you're going to tackle that as an idea. But we were able to reduce a significant amount of carbon for that. The amount of framing that's above ceilings, that's holding all the components, we were able to reduce all of those components as well, and that's a significant amount of carbon. For the building insulation, we were able to pick materials that hold over 50% reductions in their own EPDs over industry baselines, so that gave us a lot of benefit there. The gypsum board, I think, challenge to the industry. Let's all make sure we reach out to our peers in that product category because there's a lot more opportunities. Right now, they're only sitting at about 15% below the industry averages. And then carpeting, much higher in its recycled content, closer to 75%. But I would caution you on these particularly. Don't go for the extremely low carbon if the service life isn't going to be there. A minor sass to my LA office, they did try to go for the lowest embodied carbon, and we ended up having to have that carpet replaced in 2 years with the client. And so watch that service life. That's important. Is the product fit for use for its intended purpose? That's a very important question that we have to ask. I would challenge each of us, just knowing that we spend 90% of our days in the built environment, that we look specifically at the chemicals that are also there. And so we made a point of trying to remove as much PVC and orthophthalates from our products and what we selected in there. And that was particularly in both the yarns and just flat out removing the backing completely from the carpet itself. So at the DD phase, with this using an internal tool that we built, we actually were able to calculate the full carbon footprint for the building and came in at about 108 kilograms of CO2 equivalent. From an A1 to A3, it was about a 70% reduction off of baseline. So that was pretty exciting. That was the first time we'd ever kind of seen the whole building. And then we took it a step further and said, okay, how can we now execute this? So in looking at this for the CDs, the contracting team can't read our minds. We have to write this down. So again, here's some of the DSPECS research we had in gypsum board. We actually wrote the global warming potential limits into our specifications. And so do remember all the points that Emmy had mentioned and on what she was looking for from her side, from the construction side. And as you're writing this, I want you to think about how you're writing those limits down, highlight the manufacturers that had EPDs and HPDs. And I can tell you that we removed from our master specs people that did not have these level of transparency documents. And so this performance is no longer optional. It's not because I like it as an architect. It's because it is a technical performance criteria and it's non-negotiable. And that is why it is in the part 2 section of each of the technical sections. It doesn't just hide in division 1. This is part of the product's performance as far as we are concerned in how to do this. And that being, I think, have a target plan. If you know you're searching, looking for a lead credit for EPDs and HPDs, write out that plan so you can hand it to the contracting team and say, when you're procuring this, this was our plan on how to get the reductions in EPDs and HPDs. If you need to switch something out for procurement, give me another one. Trade out in that instance for us. A shout out to Atelier 10 who did the next 2 slides in terms of how much final calculation of embodied carbon. We were excited that their numbers came out very similarly to our internal tool. So we did in the end come out with 110 kilograms of CO2 equivalent, which is about a 70% reduction for our embodied carbon. I would like to asterisk, while we drove embodied carbon down, there are other reporting categories if you're going after the lead credit. And so watch your levers in your slot machine. As you pull one down, you may by accident tip one up. And so just making sure that you're aware of that in a more holistic way. So overall, the building, we were 100, again, I mentioned we were net zero energy, so we reduced 108% of our own operational energy. We were 23.1 kBTU was what our energy was for PEY. We had 85% reduction in carbon for structures, and the whole building came in at 70. So we're pretty proud and excited that we were able to kind of embody San Mateo County's environmental goals with the building that they now are occupying fully. And this is definitely not the work of one human being. There are thousands of people that have contributed to this throughout the way. So just want to huge shout out and thank you to those folks. So with that, those are the 2 main presentations. We actually wanted to open this up for discussion. We have a couple of questions that are prepped and we can get you guys started, but we're also wanting to encourage any questions from online or in the room of things that you have burning thoughts about. So with that, I guess we can get started unless there's questions here in the room. Good.
That's right. So obviously you expanded more than just those 4 categories.
We sure did.
Do you guys have a feel, is this going to become a trend, or do you think stay with those 4 categories, or are we going to
from my work? So I happen to also be AI San Francisco's president. Oh, sorry. There was a question. Thank you, Mike. There was a question in the room here about do we think the 4 categories currently documented under Cal Green will continue to expand, or if we'll remain with these 4. So I happen to be AI San Francisco's president this year, and I've been working with our representatives at the state level. And we understand from the working groups that they are likely to continue to expand as the products continue in maturity. So I would encourage that each of you really work closely with your manufacturers and start to become more and more familiar and encourage that expansion to continue to accelerate, because we know if we don't lean in, the regulation sure will. Does that answer your question? Yeah. We're starting with these four, guys. We'll challenge accepted. Challenge accepted. You guys would be surprised what each of you can achieve if you simply just start by measuring. It'd be amazing.
Well, and I would add, in addition to the four, the Cal Green requirement added on concrete,
They did.
which was notably missed in the Buy Clean California legislation, and
Is in part of the Cal Green regulations.
Yeah.
And the National Ready Mix Association actually has been all over this from the beginning, has already leaned in very clearly there.
There thresholds for Buy Clean, or is it every project?
I don't know if I can go back.
The question is if there's minimum thresholds like dollar volume and or square footage associated with Buy Clean California. There are certainly there are definitely requirements for which jurisdiction which state jurisdiction there is. I think Buy Clean California covers most jurisdictions like DGS and the UC system, but there's a few exempt jurisdictions and I can't remember them off the top of my head. Does it say that they're?
It says specifically public works. And at least when we're bidding on projects, we specifically start with what are the regulations that are there? Is this a Buy Clean, a product, a project or agency, is it going to fall under Cal Green because of the sizes? You kind of have to start with what's the game that you're supposed to be playing for this particular project.
Yeah, we can definitely look that up afterwards too, but there are some folks who are exempt. I want to say something like health or something.
Yeah, there's a couple of folks that are exempt.
Yeah, but
not
certainly if there's any state funding whatsoever, start by assuming that there are limits. And then again, after interacting with their AHJ, they might say, actually, we're not part of that for reasons X, Y, Z, but any exemption get documented in writing. I would say, yeah, it's better to be safe than sorry in terms of assuming.
What's interesting is with Buy Clean having come in 2022, now with the new code adoption in 24, nearly all projects are going to basically be functioning under these categories. So I think it's safe to assume that, yes, we as practitioners are going to have to look at these numbers in more closely than we had before. And again, that's a good thing for us to be able to have that aspiration. Mike, any questions online as well?
Yes, there is. Daniel asks, is it likely that the multifamily residential will be included in the embodied carbon tracking required project type in the 2025 code cycle update?
I flip back over to that page. Sorry for the flipping. I'm not trying to give you guys Tourette's, I swear. I just want to make sure that we're up here on the same page. So right now, again, we're in non-residential. I haven't heard that specifically residential will be added, but I'm all for encouraging that at the state, if that's what you're asking, Daniel. So again, here
that is what I'm asking. Can you hear me?
To reduce and measure. Right now, we haven't heard of it, but again, these are regulations that are being championed by the state architect, Ida St. Clair. So she's leaning into this. So I would not be surprised if this continues to expand. If it's not this cycle, then even the next, right?
What about fabrication on site? Is that measured any differently? If it's brought out already constructed and put on like a curtain wall or a precast panel?
So there's a question on the room here about how are we doing the measurements. There is the measurements, where the fabrication or how the fabrication happens is all governed by those ISO standards. Yes, you have to go back the other way. If we can put the ISO standards back up on the screen, you'll see, it's further back than that. Or you would try to use
I was trying to use the cradle to gate concept to explain where the limits for at least Buy Clean California are, where it's really when it leaves the fabrication facility is where those global warming potential limits are drawn. And that's pretty typical of most EPDs, where they draw the limit at like where it's shipped to the job site effectively.
But the key is the fabrication is still taken into account. Yeah, if you just go back to go back. Oh, you're driving the other way. It's right. Sorry again for those online. I was trying to go back to this guy.
Yeah, there you go.
Right. So ultimately, the fabrication is still in. And again, we typically are documenting this in an A1 to A3. I think maybe where the question, if I could reframe slightly, would be, do all instances take into account how much carbon is really handled with on-site fabrication? Right now, that isn't always captured. Right. Typically, because what can we as architects and engineers document, it ends up being an A1 to A3 that then we pass.
Hey, yeah, we met the other
Hard
day.
sometimes to catch that A5 scope of what really is on-site construction and fabrication.
No way.
Regulations that are covered.
Awesome.
Thinking through all of the great work that's in Cal Green for us diverting waste and how much recycling has to happen. Right. We forget in the Bay Area specifically that how lucky we are that we actually have that many streams of waste that we can sort through and how much recycling happens. That's not happening in all parts of the country. So it's actually, we're very blessed in that regard. And it's a good thing to lean in, but we're catching it in other ways. And if there's ways that we can partner between architects and contractors to talk about material waste, I would say it starts in design, frankly. If we know a product comes in a certain size, we as architects should design and respect that size that it's fabricated in and think through, how can I reduce waste that I don't need something to be cut on site, that I've actually installed it at the size that it's fabricated at. And then again, it goes back to dialogue between the architects, the contractors, the manufacturers, of the thoughtfulness that's going into how we design our work.
If I could also add to that, I would say that for most pre-manufactured products like insulation or glass, we're not making really anything on site. But the one exception that comes into effect now with the Cal Green code cycle update is concrete. And again, most of the EPDs qualify that once it leaves the plant, that's when the line is drawn in the sand. But if you were planning on batch mixing on site, then suddenly you don't really have access to the creation of those EPDs anymore. And so one of the things that we're looking into is, does this latest code cycle preclude us from being able to do batch mixing on site? And if we do need to do batch mixing on site, how are we going to account for that in terms of demonstrating compliance if you do plan on going that prescriptive route for the Cal Green regulation?
Okay. If there are any other questions, either in the room or online, we could look at some of the questions that we had also prepared for. Please.
Or basically embedded carbon versus operational carbon. What's the percentage?
So over the life cycle of I'm not sure we have that in there. Over the life cycle of the building, operational to embodied is nearly 50-50. If we just look back, if I go back to your, but what's fascinating, and sorry, the question online, there was a question of what's the balance between embodied and operational. If you look at the life cycle of a building, which typically is judged right now in the United States at 60 years, it's about 50-50. But what's important to remember is we are in a critical moment of time in these next 5 to 10 years that we must rapidly draw down our carbon. In order to do that, where's your greatest impact? Embodied carbon, because that's the carbon that's being released right now in what we're doing today, right? And it takes us, a year or two to document, a couple of years to build, right? The impact that what is on your boards today and what we are finishing in construction today is going to help the solution of what we are facing as a planet. And so it actually right now, that is why you're seeing such an emphasis on embodied carbon, because the timing. And that's the operational carbon. And that's the 50-50 balance of trying to reduce. If you look just in the near term, the 10 years, the skew is about 80% embodied and 20% operational, but the lifetime of the building, it is a balanced number. So you have to still look at both, right? If we shift all to embodied carbon and forget operational carbon while we're doing great strides here in the grid and reducing the duck curve, we're not there yet.
Excuse me, how much of the embedded carbon is concrete?
In terms of the percentage of the market?
Cement production alone is responsible for 8% of global carbon emissions, and steel is about 7%, but that also includes things like rail or making of cars. So those two materials own about 15% of global carbon emissions. The rest of it are fairly negligible in the grand scheme of thing. And if you look at the carbon footprint of the building, I would say about 80% of the embodied carbon lives with the structure itself, if not more, probably closer to 85, based on the models that we've been seeing to date. Obviously, if you're an architect who does primarily, TIs, that number is going to be very different for your organization, right? But for a typical ground up building, really it's in the bones of the building versus, the finishes is what we've seen. I would also say, going back to your original question of the percent makeup of where the carbon lives in a building, the important thing to also recognize is I think in California, we have a grid decarbonization goal by 2045. So by
We do.
2045, we're supposed to be on 100% renewables. And in addition to that, we're supposed to be cutting out gas furnaces and boilers and such in our building. So effectively over time, if you think about the operational footprint of a building, just even if nothing else changed, right? The grid's going to get cleaner and we're going to get off of boilers. So the operational carbon footprint of a building is going to go to zero theoretically by the year 2045 in the state of California, which makes our entire carbon footprint associated with the embodied emissions of the materials we get. It's really important.
Yeah, well, I was just saying the Pacific Northwest is leading the way on that when they've actually almost completely cleaned their grid at this point. So it's different region to region. We practice all across the country. And I have to say the challenge that we're having in our practice in New York versus Chicago versus DC is a much different question. And obviously more heavily operational focused because their grids are so dirty. And that is a huge impact to what we're doing. So I have to say, again, I really appreciate leadership that's happening on the West Coast in trying to clean the grids and that what each of us are doing locally and trying to produce on-site renewables and really, again, trying to curb our energy uses. I think every little bit helps as we do this.
Any other questions?
There's one more question from Frank. Excellent presentation and so important. What's your advice for next steps?
I'll lean in if you want as a start. Thank you. And we can do this, right? I know that it feels when looking at a technical presentation like this, that it's overwhelming. There's a lot of numbers. Yes, there are spreadsheets. No, math is not scary. I swear both my parents as math teachers didn't pay me to tell you that. You can do this. It does take a shift in mindset. You have to start in early design and construction, thinking and knowing this. Every person needs to buy into this. The client, the consultants, the contracting team, everyone needs to believe that this is what we're doing and why. We talk about it during bidding interviews. We talk about it during interviews with our own consultants that this is something we're committing to. And through each decision you make, understand that you have the power of the pen and that you can in fact reduce both your operational and your embodied with the decisions that you're making at the and if we don't choose to do this, the regulations are sure going to help us get there. And so you can do it with today's standards and the products and keep it on budget. Right? That's an important thing. A lot of people have a misconception that this costs more. It doesn't have to. It takes planning and strategy and you thinking about this as a team and committing to these reductions, and you can come in on budget. Because with the COB3 project, we proved to you that you did, and that was before the regulations were in place. Right? So
I would also say that, I would say before like 2018, we used to think that general contractors really didn't have any place in the green building conversation except to build what was in specifications. And we've now found that we have a pretty big part because a lot of these requirements are performance-based specifications that we're now needing to meet. And so we have a really big purchasing opportunities as GC to help meet these. And one way that I found we are kind of underutilized is really testing that question is if this costs more. So for example, I can tell you that in the Bay Area, you can hit 20% below NRMCA baseline at no additional cost for almost all projects, because we took that same question and we went to our 7 top concrete bidders in the Bay Area and we asked them that question. They said, yeah, no problem. There's no additional cost, 30%, maybe a little bit more. Here's what you should plug in your estimate if you want to do that. And you can take that information and you can go to the client and that client can say, yeah, I'm willing to cut down on our carbon footprint by another 300 tons at a cost of X. But you do need to engage your general contractor to be able to tell you if the limits that are being proposed are feasible at no additional cost, or if it does come at a premium. I'll give you another example. Metal deck. On the West Coast, our metal deck is made often from basic oxygen furnace facilities, right? And those are higher carbon facilities than electric arc furnaces, which are all east of the Mississippi effectively. So you can get that lower carbon metal deck, no problem, but you're gonna have to pay additional handling and shipping to get it to the West Coast on your job. And you can quantify the carbon savings and the premium associated with that very easily. But if you just throw in EAF as the baseline specification, with the expectation it's going to be free because you read it on EC3 and it looks good on paper, it might actually come at additional cost because, you know, our market on the West Coast is different from the market on the East Coast. And we're happy to engage on those conversations as general contractors, but we need to receive kind of the intent of what the carbon reduction story is going to be. And then we'll connect you with our local bidding market and answer definitively in advance of even finalizing the DD set or the CD set. So
The key is it's going to take conversation, right? Those questions of the simple, there is no cost if you go to a certain percentage limit. That talks to, again, the opportunity for the design team, the engineers to have those conversations directly with the manufacturers, with the contractors to say, where is that limit? We often talk about it from a cost perspective, right? If I have a 10-foot two piece of glass versus a 10-foot piece of glass, there literally is a cost difference for 2 inches. Did you really need that 2 inches? It's a similar conversation as you're trying to reduce carbon. Where's the limit? Where is it really a premium starts to happen? What's the trigger point in the fabrication process? So I think if we each kind of take down our silos and say that together, all of us at the table having candid conversations of how can we target and reduce the carbon, we will get there as a group, but it's going to take conversation with each other and being open to saying, okay, maybe I don't need that glass line to be 10.2. Maybe I can accept a 10 because that's going to be easier to fabricate, easier to reduce carbon. So a lot of opportunities there. Are there any final questions from either the room or online? In the room.
Other ways we find websites where we go and they're already where all the answers are, right? Is there gonna be something like that, do you think, for like biking, so that we can just go there and know that, oh, this is the right place to get the JIT board from the right facility that we know is gonna meet the reductions?
So currently there is not, so the question is, where can we find all this information? That is actually probably the doozy of the question right now, is that there isn't one place to find all the information. The current websites that are out there and available, a lot of them are pay to play, I'll be honest with you. And so some information is in some places and they're not always in all places. I know the AIA is trying to lean in on this because of the 2030 challenge and is partnering with folks to try to get a more centralized database. So I think that is in process. If you had asked me 2 years ago, I'd said, holy heck, we're not even there yet. It's going to go take you 10 websites to get there. We're getting better, even just in the last 2 years of how we are able to reduce how many websites you need to get all of the data. So I think you're going to continue to see that to drive toward the 2030 challenge. And this is part of now the requirements in us reporting, those of us that are signatories. We report our projects now inclusive of embodied carbon. At S1, we've actually reported our embodied carbon on all 150 something projects we have for the last 2 years. This is just what we believe in and what we are doing. You're going to see this more and more now that it's starting to become part of the requirements for 2030 and now with Cal Green. So I think stay tuned. Right now, it is driving toward the DDX software and the AIA's partnerships with manufacturers and trying to get one place to go. So it will become easier. It is important to note in the regulations that Cal Green issued, they've cited where their baselines are coming from. So I think that's good. We don't have to guess and read their minds of what their baseline is. They've actually cited it in their reference documents. So I do encourage you to go take a look at the new code adoptions. It's pretty clear where they're coming from, and then we'll see how they continue to reduce the percentages off those baselines.
I would also say that EC3 isn't the end all be all for embodied carbon for everything, but it is a good starting point. I believe there's a Buy Clean California compliance filter on there, which will kind of tell you at a glance which some of the manufacturers are that'll fall below that. The only thing that I would caution you on, one is that there's an uncertainty factor built into the numbers on EC3, so it might not be the exact number that shows up on the facility specific part of the EPD. So just make sure you're double checking that. And then again, I've seen folks pull info from EC3 and say, look, there's, 3 people who can meet this, but guess what? They're not part of our standard supply chain here locally in California. Like, just because it's available in Europe doesn't mean that it's feasible to get it here locally. So just approach using that tool with an extra layer of caution and just understand it's a starting point and not the final decision maker for compliance.
Is there any current like wrongful products that have been announced on the Cal Green, or does that have to go through the manufacturer? Or is that
I'm not sure. Do you happen to know if it's product specific?
Yeah, so Cal Green right now is set as a global warming potential number, not product specific. Let's see if I can go backward here. It's not product specific. It's specifically looking at a global warming potential limit. So we're looking for our manufacturers being transparent and leaning in from a sustainability perspective. And do they have this documentation for EPDs and HPDs? With EPDs, are they type 3? Have they been independently validated? Is the information compliant? And then from there, you can now start making decisions. So I think that we're going to see a trend toward manufacturers that are more transparent and have committed to sustainability. If that helps. And again, we as the specifiers and the contractors procuring, we can help move that needle by asking for this information. And once you hear that repeatedly from multiple sources, I think manufacturers that had not necessarily known what an EPD when I had called the first time, I think they're starting to get the message now that this actually is very important in our process and something that we're all committed to and what we're looking for. Any other final thoughts?
Nope, I'm good on my side.
I think just the last thing is that don't underestimate the number of people who care in the industry. I know that sometimes people look at general contractors and like, oh, they don't want to deal with any of this. But there's a large number of people, especially in California, who really care about this, and we're trying to do the right thing. And we're happy to help where we can in terms of shifting the needle. So I share your sentiments where this is doable. We should be advocates for it, not just sighing because it's another piece of legislation. But, the alternative is we can't get carpet from China because their docks are underwater because the sea level's risen, right? And or we can't get laborers on site because their homes are burning down over in Modesto or whatever. So it's really critical for us to care about this as an industry, and I'm really excited to see a bunch of people in the room who similarly care about it. And I think we should look at this with optimism as an industry.
Well, and knowing that we're going to get through it together, and that it's going to take each of us as we onboard this new legislation, working together collaboratively toward this goal. And I think if we start the projects aware of this and knowing that we've adopted it and we're going to execute on it, we will find a path forward on this. And not a minute too soon, hopefully. So, Mike, is there anything in closing? Well, with that, at least here in the room, thanks so much for those who came in 3D. It was a lot of fun, and appreciate the online audience in 2D. Yeah, for those that do have a couple more minutes, I think feel free to stay here in the room, and happy to have more further conversation. But thanks so much for the conversation that we had, and looking forward to many more nights in the future, both either here in AIA East Bay or other places throughout the community. Always good to have discussions about how we can tackle embodied carbon together.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.